The air in the courtroom hung heavy, thick with anticipation as every eye turned toward the towering figure of Judge Theodore Grayson. He reclined in his high-backed chair, the polished wood creaking faintly under his weight, his presence dominating the room like a storm cloud ready to break. A slow, self-satisfied grin crept across his face, his lips curling with a hint of disdain. When he spoke, his voice cut through the silence like a blade, laced with mockery that echoed off the paneled walls. "Miss Carter," he drawled, his tone dripping with superiority, "do you even realize where you're standing right now? This isn't some playground for teenage games. It's a court of law, a place for serious business." A ripple of laughter erupted from the gallery. The attorneys, perched behind their desks like vultures waiting for a feast, exchanged smirks and knowing glances, their polished suits rustling as they shifted in amusement. The sound bounced around the room, amplifying the weight of the moment. At the center of it all stood a lone figure, a teenage girl named Amelia Carter. Her wild, curly hair spilled over her shoulders in a chaotic tangle, barely tamed by the dim light of the courtroom. She wore a faded gray hoodie paired with worn-out jeans, a stark contrast to the crisp formality surrounding her. Her sneakers, scuffed and slightly muddy, squeaked against the gleaming hardwood floor as she shifted her weight, the tiny sound cutting through the tension like a nervous heartbeat. In her arms, she clutched a towering stack of papers, the edges frayed and uneven as if they'd been pulled together in a frantic rush. The pile looked almost comically large against her slight frame, threatening to topple with every breath she took. Her cheeks flushed a deep crimson, betraying the heat of embarrassment or perhaps defiance coursing through her. Yet her eyes told a different story. Steady and unyielding, they locked onto the judge, refusing to waver even as the room buzzed with ridicule. She drew in a shaky breath, her voice emerging soft but resolute, cutting through the lingering chuckles like a whisper in a storm. "Your Honor," she began, pausing just long enough to steady herself against the wave of jeers, "I'm here to—" But before she could finish, Judge Grayson's hand shot up, slicing through the air with dismissive arrogance. "Spare me," he snapped, his voice booming now, all traces of amusement replaced by impatience. "This courtroom doesn't have the luxury of indulging childish stunts. I can't even fathom why they let this farce proceed in the first place." Amelia's jaw tightened, her fingers curling around the edges of her papers until her knuckles whitened. She tilted her chin upward, a spark of determination flaring in her gaze. "If you just let me speak, Your Honor," she said, her voice firming with every word, "you might find it's worth your time." A collective gasp rippled through the room. The audacity of it, a teenage girl barely old enough to drive, daring to challenge a judge in his own domain, was unthinkable. Grayson's smirk faltered, replaced by a deepening scowl as he leaned forward, his shadow stretching across the bench. "Well then," he said, his tone now a venomous blend of sarcasm and curiosity, "go ahead and enlighten us all." The courtroom fell into a stunned hush, every breath held, waiting for what would come next. Little did they know this was only the beginning of a showdown that would leave them all speechless. The courtroom hung in a fragile silence, every pair of eyes fixed on Amelia Carter as she stood beneath the weight of Judge Grayson's piercing gaze. She shifted slightly, the rustle of her oversized hoodie barely audible in the stillness. With a steadying breath, she reached for the chaotic stack of papers in her arms, her fingers brushing against the worn edges as she straightened them with care. Then she began to speak, and what came next was nothing short of astonishing. Her voice, though soft at first, grew stronger with every word, weaving through the room like a thread pulling tight. She didn't stumble or falter, instead she launched into a seamless cascade of arguments, each one sharper and more precise than the last. Legal precedents rolled off her tongue, cases most seasoned attorneys would need hours to recall. She cited constitutional clauses with the ease of a scholar, her words painting a vivid picture of justice wronged. Court procedures, intricate and dry to most, flowed from her lips as if she'd been born to unravel them. It was a performance that didn't just demand attention, it commanded it. Around the room, the mood shifted like a tide turning. The attorneys, who moments ago had been snickering behind their polished desks, now sat upright, their pens scratching furiously against notepads. Their smirks faded, replaced by furrowed brows and hurried glances as if they'd suddenly realized they'd underestimated their opponent. The gallery, once buzzing with mockery, fell into a hush, the air thick with disbelief. This wasn't some fumbling teenager playing pretend. This was a force, raw and unpolished, but undeniably brilliant. Judge Grayson's expression betrayed him most of all. His smug grin dissolved, replaced by a flicker of unease that danced across his weathered face. He leaned forward, elbows pressing into the bench, his fingers steepled as if to steady himself against the onslaught of Amelia's words. For a moment, he looked less like a towering authority and more like a man caught off guard, grappling with the impossible unfolding before him. The room waited, breathless, as she delivered her final point, a razor-sharp conclusion that landed like a gavel strike. When she finished, a heavy silence blanketed the courtroom, broken only by the faint creak of Grayson's chair as he shifted. His eyes narrowed, searching her face as if trying to solve a puzzle. Then, in a voice stripped of its earlier venom, he blurted, "Who are you?" Amelia paused, her chest rising and falling as she caught her breath. She met his gaze unflinchingly, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips, a smile that held both pride and quiet defiance. "I'm Amelia Carter," she said simply, her tone steady as stone, "and I'm here to defend my client." The words ignited chaos. The gallery erupted into a storm of gasps and whispers, voices overlapping in a frenzy of shock and curiosity. Attorneys muttered to one another, their notes forgotten as they craned their necks to get a better look at her. Judge Grayson slammed his gavel down, the sharp crack echoing like thunder, demanding order, but even he couldn't hide the tremor in his composure. His eyes lingered on Amelia wide with a mix of disbelief and something else, grudging respect, perhaps. A teenage girl, armed with nothing but a stack of papers and a fierce will, had just turned the courtroom upside down. How could someone so young hold such authority, such raw power in a place built to crush the unprepared? The question hung in the air, unanswered as the chaos swirled. And then, for the first time, a shadow of hesitation flickered across Amelia's face, her calm facade cracking just enough to hint at something deeper, something yet to be revealed. The room stilled again, all eyes locked on her, waiting for the next move in a game no one had expected her to play so well. Let's step back in time. 2 weeks before Amelia Carter stood defiant in that courtroom, before she turned a room full of skeptics into believers. Picture a small, cluttered bedroom, the kind where every inch tells a story. The walls were lined with shelves sagging under the weight of thick, leather-bound law books, their spines cracked and faded from years of use. Scattered across the floor were legal pads, scribbled with notes in a hurried, jagged handwriting. A dim lamp flickered on a rickety desk, casting long shadows that danced across the room, and there, in the heart of it all, sat Amelia. She was hunched over one of those books, her wild curls spilling over her face like a curtain, her brow furrowed in fierce concentration. The books weren't hers. They belonged to her older brother, James, a man who'd once dreamed of wielding the law like a shield for the helpless. But James wasn't here anymore. His absence hung in the air, a quiet ache that fueled every page Amelia turned, every line she memorized. She'd made a promise, not to him aloud, but to herself in the silence of her heart, to carry on what he'd started. The bedroom door creaked open and in bounced Lily, Amelia's best friend, her energy a stark contrast to the stillness. She flopped onto the bed, cross-legged and carefree, a bag of potato chips crinkling in her hands. "You've lost it, you know that, right?" Lily said, popping a chip into her mouth with a loud crunch. "You're 16, Amelia, 16. You're not a lawyer. You're supposed to be, I don't know, sneaking out to parties or something." Amelia's pen froze mid-sentence, hovering over a page of case summaries. She looked up, her eyes locking onto Lily's with an intensity that made the room feel smaller. "I don't care what I'm supposed to be," she said, her voice low but unshakable. "This is what I have to do." Lily tilted her head, the playful glint in her eyes softening. "Why, though?" she asked, her tone gentler now, almost pleading. "Why can't you just let it go?" For a moment, Amelia didn't answer. Her gaze drifted to one of James's textbooks, its cover worn smooth from his hands. She flipped it open, her fingers tracing a highlighted passage as memories flooded back. James laughing, James teaching her how to argue, James promising her she could be anything. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper but heavy with resolve. "Because someone has to fight for the people who can't fight for themselves. And James, he believed I could." Lily fell silent, the crunch of chips replaced by the weight of those words. She watched as Amelia turned back to her work, her pen moving again with a quiet fury. There was no arguing with that kind of conviction, but there was something Amelia didn't say, something she kept locked deep inside, a truth too raw to share even with her best friend. This wasn't just about justice for others, it was about proving something to herself. After James was gone, the world had shifted around her. Teachers spoke to her in hushed tones, neighbors avoided her gaze, and even her parents tiptoed through their own home, treating her like a fragile thing that might shatter at any moment. But Amelia wasn't fragile. She was steel-wrapped in a teenage frame, smart, relentless, and burning with a need to show everyone they'd been wrong about her. Those law books weren't just tools. They were her armor, her way to claw back control from a life that had tried to break her. Back in that little room, as Lily watched her friend dive deeper into a world of statutes and precedents, one thing was clear. Amelia was preparing for a battle no one else saw coming. What seemed impossible to everyone else was to her the only path forward. And soon the courtroom would feel the full force of what she'd been building in the shadows. The courtroom buzzed with a restless energy as Amelia Carter squared her shoulders, her sneakers squeaking faintly against the polished floor. She'd just silenced the room with her unexpected brilliance, but the air was still crackling, charged with tension that felt like it could spark at any moment. Judge Grayson, perched high on his bench, rubbed his jaw, his earlier arrogance replaced by a wary curiosity. He leaned forward, his shadow stretching across the room, and fixed her with a stare that could have melted steel. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice slow and deliberate, like he was testing the weight of every word, "you're telling me you're here to represent the defendant? Tell me, where exactly did you study law to pull off a stunt like this?" Amelia didn't flinch. She stood tall, or as tall as her slight frame allowed, her wild curls framing her face like a defiant crown. "I didn't go to law school, Your Honor," she replied, her tone steady despite the storm brewing around her. "But for the past year, I've buried myself in legal texts, court records, and every case I could get my hands on. I've learned what I need to know, and I'm certain I can defend my client." A murmur rippled through the gallery, a mix of disbelief and intrigue. Grayson's bushy eyebrows shot up, his fingers drumming on the bench as if he couldn't decide whether to laugh or scold her. "You're certain?" he echoed, his voice thick with skepticism. "This isn't a game of confidence, young lady. The law doesn't bend for belief. It demands credentials, training, things you clearly don't have." "Then let me prove it," Amelia shot back, her words cutting through the room like a blade. Her eyes burned with a quiet fire, daring him to test her. "Give me a chance to show what I can do." The courtroom held its breath, every onlooker hanging on Grayson's next move. His lips twitched, caught between a smirk and a frown as he weighed her defiance against the absurdity of it all. A teenage girl, no degree, no license, standing toe-to-toe with a judge, it was unheard of. But before he could respond, the heavy double doors at the back of the room swung open with a groan, shattering the standoff. A tall man strode in, his footsteps echoing with purpose across the hardwood. He was dressed in a sharp gray suit that seemed to gleam under the courtroom lights, his polished shoes clicking with every step. A leather briefcase swung lightly in his hand, exuding an air of quiet authority that made the whispers in the room die down instantly. He stopped just short of the bench, his posture straight as an arrow, and gave Grayson a respectful nod. "Your Honor," he said, his deep voice rolling through the space like distant thunder, "my name is Daniel Hayes, and I'm with the Bar Association. I believe I can shed some light on this unusual situation." Amelia turned, her heart skipping a beat. The confidence she'd clung to wavered for a split second, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. Who was this man? His presence shifted the room's gravity, pulling every eye toward him. The attorneys straightened in their seats, the gallery leaned forward, and even Grayson sat up a little taller, his curiosity piqued. Hayes set his briefcase down with a soft thud, his gaze sweeping the room before settling on Amelia. "We've received a report," he continued, his tone measured but firm, "about an individual without proper licensing attempting to act as counsel in this court. It's a matter that demands clarification." Amelia's stomach twisted, but she held her ground, her fingers tightening around her stack of papers. The stakes had just climbed higher, and the shadow of doubt loomed larger than ever. Who was Daniel Hayes, and what did his arrival mean for her fight? One thing was certain, the battle she'd started was about to get a whole lot tougher. The courtroom pulsed with a restless hum as Daniel Hayes stood before the bench, his crisp gray suit a stark contrast to the chaos he'd just walked into. His words hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst, an unlicensed individual trying to play lawyer in a court of law. Every eye darted to Amelia Carter, who stood rooted to the spot, her sneakers scuffing the floor as she shifted under the weight of his gaze. The stack of papers in her arms trembled slightly, but her face stayed steady, a mask of determination hiding the flicker of panic beneath. Judge Grayson leaned back, his chair creaking ominously as he crossed his arms. A sly smirk tugged at his lips, his earlier skepticism now tinged with a hint of triumph. "So, Mr. Hayes," he said, his voice smooth and cutting, "it seems Miss Carter here lacks the proper credentials. I suspected as much. This whole thing has been irregular from the start, downright absurd if you ask me." Grayson's smirk widened, his fingers tapping the bench like a predator sizing up its prey. "This isn't a stage for your little performance, Miss Carter," he shot back, his tone sharp enough to slice through the tension. "Do you even grasp how serious this is? You're meddling in a system that doesn't bend for amateurs." "I do," Amelia replied, quick and unflinching, "and I also grasp that my client's life is on the line. If no one steps up for him, who will? I'm not here to waste your time. I'm here to fight for what's right." A low murmur spread through the room, a wave of surprise and reluctant admiration rippling across the gallery. Even a few of the attorneys, their smug grins long faded, exchanged glances that hinted at something new. Respect, maybe, or at least curiosity. Grayson's frown deepened, his composure shaken by the shift in the air. This wasn't going the way he'd expected. Before he could fire back, Daniel Hayes cleared his throat, drawing every eye back to him. He adjusted his tie with a calm precision, his deep voice cutting through the buzz like a steady drumbeat. "Your Honor," he said, his words measured but carrying an unexpected weight, "while this situation is certainly unconventional, I'd argue it's only fair to let Miss Carter make her case. The law exists to serve justice, not to silence those willing to stand for it." The room stilled, the weight of his statement sinking in. Grayson's eyes narrowed, darting between Hayes and Amelia as if caught in a trap he hadn't seen coming. His fingers stopped tapping, curling into a fist as he wrestled with his options. Finally, he let out a long, grudging sigh, the sound heavy with exasperation. "Fine," he said, his tone clipped and cold. "Miss Carter, you can proceed for now, but mark my words. One misstep, one hint that you're wasting this court's time, and I'll shut this down faster than you can blink. Understood?" "Yes, Your Honor," Amelia said, relief flooding her voice like a dam breaking. She let out a shaky breath, her shoulders easing just a fraction as she clutched her papers tighter. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but she'd cleared the first hurdle. She turned to face the room, ready to dive back into her argument, her mind racing with the next move. But the story was far from finished. The air still crackled with unspoken questions. How far could she push this? What secrets was she hiding beneath that fierce exterior? And what would happen when the full weight of her past came crashing into the present? The courtroom watched, waiting as the unassuming teenage girl prepared to take on a system that wasn't ready for her. Amelia Carter wasn't always the fearless figure standing tall in that courtroom, her voice steady against a tide of doubt. Just a year ago, she was someone entirely different, a regular teenage girl with a life painted in softer shades. Back then, her days were filled with the hum of high school hallways, the chatter of friends planning weekend hangouts, and the comfort of a world that hadn't yet tested her limits. She wasn't the type to pick fights or chase impossible dreams. But that was before everything changed, before a single moment rewrote her story and set her on a collision course with destiny. It all started with her brother, James. To Amelia, he wasn't just family, he was her hero, her compass, the one who made the world make sense. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a laugh that could light up a room and a mind sharp enough to cut through any argument, James was the kind of person people looked up to. He was 2 months away from finishing law school, his future gleaming like a polished trophy. He'd sit with Amelia for hours, his textbook spread across the kitchen table, teaching her the art of debate with a grin and a challenge. "You've got a fire in you, kid. Don't let anyone put it out." She'd roll her eyes, but deep down she believed him. Then came the night that shattered everything. James got tangled in a scuffle outside a bar, a messy clash with a wealthy businessman named Victor Grant. The details were murky, but Grant claimed James attacked him, spinning a tale of unprovoked violence. James swore it was self-defense, his voice steady but desperate as he told Amelia the truth over a crackling phone line from jail. "I didn't start it, I swear. He came at me first." She believed him. How could she not? But the system didn't care. Their family scraped together what little they had, but it wasn't enough for a top-tier lawyer. The public defender assigned to James was a shadow of what he needed. Overworked, distracted, barely glancing at the case before court. In the end, the gavel fell and James was sentenced to 3 years behind bars. Amelia was there in the courtroom that day, her hands clenched so tight her nails left crescent marks in her palms. She watched as her brother, her invincible, justice-loving brother, stood in handcuffs, his head bowed but his eyes still burning with defiance. The sight broke something inside her, a crack that ran deeper than tears. The system he'd believed in, the one he'd spent years studying to serve, had chewed him up and spit him out. Fairness, justice, they felt like hollow words, lies she couldn't unhear. But instead of crumbling, Amelia hardened. That night, alone in her room, she pulled one of James's law books from the shelf, its weight heavy in her hands. She flipped it open, the scent of ink and old paper filling her lungs as she traced his handwritten notes in the margins. This wasn't just grief, it was a call to arms. If the world wouldn't fight for James, she would. She'd learned the law herself, piece by piece, until she could wield it like a weapon to right the wrongs that had stolen him away. From that moment, the carefree girl faded, replaced by someone new, someone forged in loss and fueled by a quiet, unshakable resolve. She didn't care that she was young, that she had no degree, that the odds towered over her like a mountain. All she cared about was making things right, not just for James, but for anyone caught in the same merciless gears. That bedroom, once a sanctuary of teenage dreams, became her war room. And as she sat there night after night, surrounded by books and a burning purpose, Amelia Carter began to transform into the force the courtroom would soon meet. The courtroom thrummed with a nervous energy as Amelia Carter stepped back into the spotlight, her sneakers leaving faint echoes on the hardwood floor. She'd just weathered a storm of doubt from Judge Grayson and Daniel Hayes, but now it was time to focus on the reason she was here, her client, Mr. Peterson. He sat beside her at the defendant's table, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and hunched shoulders, his hands clasped tightly as if holding on to hope itself. Accused of embezzling funds from his employer, he'd sworn to Amelia he was innocent, a plea she believed with every fiber of her being. She straightened her stack of papers, the edges worn from countless hours of study, and faced the room with a steady gaze. "Your Honor," she began, her voice cutting through the tension like a lighthouse beam through fog, "the case against Mr. Peterson is built on quicksand. Flimsy, unreliable, and ready to collapse under scrutiny. I'm here to prove he's not the thief they claim, but a scapegoat caught in someone else's web." What followed was a masterclass in determination. Amelia laid out her defense with the precision of a seasoned architect, each piece slotting into place to build an unshakable foundation. She presented documents, financial records with circled discrepancies that didn't add up, timelines that poked holes in the prosecution's story. Her words were clear, her logic ironclad as she pointed to evidence suggesting someone higher up had orchestrated the crime and pinned it on Peterson. The gallery leaned forward, hanging on her every syllable, while even Judge Grayson tilted his head, his stern face softening with a grudging nod. But the tide shifted when Daniel Hayes rose again, his polished shoes gleaming as he stepped forward. His deep voice rolled through the room, calm but edged with steel. "Your Honor," he said, folding his hands behind his back, "Miss Carter's passion is commendable, no doubt, yet it doesn't change one undeniable fact. She's not a licensed attorney. Letting her carry on sets a precedent that could unravel the integrity of this court. Rules exist for a reason." Amelia's heart thudded, but she didn't back down. She turned to Grayson, her wild curls bouncing as she squared her shoulders. "Your Honor," she countered, her tone firm but respectful, "I don't have a license, that's true. But who gave me the authority to stand here? I did, by refusing to let an innocent man drown in a sea of lies. I've studied, I've prepared, and I'm ready to fight for him. Isn't that what this court is supposed to honor?" A hush fell over the room, her words ringing with a raw honesty that hit harder than any legal jargon. Grayson's eyes narrowed, his fingers drumming a slow rhythm on the bench as he wrestled with her defiance. The air grew thick, every breath held in anticipation, until the courtroom doors burst open with a jarring thud. A small figure darted inside, no older than 10, his sneakers slapping the floor as he raced toward Amelia. His wide eyes shone with urgency, his small hands clutching a crumpled envelope like it was a lifeline. "Amelia!" he shouted, his voice cracking the silence. "You forgot this!" The room erupted into gasps and murmurs. Amelia froze, her breath catching as she recognized the boy, Ethan, a neighbor who'd become like a little brother to her. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she took the envelope from him. Its faded surface was all too familiar, the handwriting on it etched into her memory. It was a letter from James, her brother, his final words to her before prison swallowed him whole, urging her to stand tall for those who couldn't. Grayson slammed his gavel, the sharp crack slicing through the chaos. "Order!" he barked, his face flushed with irritation. "What is the meaning of this interruption?" Amelia clutched the letter to her chest, her mind racing. This wasn't part of the plan. She'd never meant to bring James into this room, not like this. But Ethan's innocent act had thrust it into the open, and now every eye was on her, waiting for an answer. She met Grayson's glare, her voice steady despite the storm inside. "It's personal, Your Honor," she said, forcing the words out. "It's not about this case." Grayson's frown deepened, but before he could press further, Amelia took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. She wouldn't let this derail her, not when Mr. Peterson's freedom hung in the balance, not when James's faith in her burned brighter than ever in that crumpled note. She turned back to the bench, ready to fight on, but the shadow of bigger battles loomed. Something told her the real enemy wasn't just in this room, it was out there waiting to strike. And there you have it, folks. That's just the opening chapter of an unbelievable saga. From a teenage girl mocked in a courtroom to a force of nature shaking the foundations of power, Amelia Carter's journey is proof that courage doesn't need a title or a degree, just a heart that refuses to back down. She stepped into that room with nothing but a stack of papers and a burning will and walked out, leaving everyone questioning everything they thought they knew. But trust me, this isn't the end. It's only the spark that's about to ignite a wildfire. What happens next? Will Amelia keep pushing against the giant standing in her way? Can she unravel the secrets that threaten to bury her? I want to hear what you think. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Did she surprise you, inspire you? Let's talk about it. And if you're hooked on this roller coaster of justice, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss the next twist in her tale. This story's got more layers to peel back, and I promise you it's only going to get wilder from here. See you in the next one.